December 22nd, 1944. Somewhere around noon, a frozen Belgian town called Bastogne, sitting on a high plateau in the middle of the Ardennes forest. Inside a stone military barracks known as the Heinz Kaserne, Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe is asleep in his quarters. He has been awake for most of the previous 4 days. His division has been fighting without adequate ammunition, without winter clothing, without enough food, and with no realistic prospect of resupply by road. German armoured units have sealed every road out of Bastogne. The town is completely encircled. Temperatures outside are dropping well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and the men in the foxholes surrounding the town have been stuffing newspaper inside their boots to hold off frostbite. McAuliffe's acting chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, walks into the sleeping quarters and wakes him. The Germans have sent people forward, not to attack, under a white flag, with a message. McAuliffe, still half inside his sleeping bag, hears Moore use the word surrender and says a single word under his breath. According to Moore, and every officer in the adjacent communications room, the word was nuts. Then he climbed out of his bunk. He did not know it yet, but that single syllable was about to become the most famous reply in the history of the United States Army. It was about to tell a German general whose family name went back to the 14th century, who commanded 3 divisions and tens of thousands of men, that his formal ultimatum was not worth the 2 sheets of paper it had been typed on. This is the story of how a Washington boy with Irish roots, an artillery background, and no particular taste for drama walked into the most desperate week of his career and answered overwhelming force with one word that American soldiers still repeat 80 years later. It is also the story of what that week actually cost, what it looked like from the German side of the wire, and why the word landed the way it did. To understand what happened in Bastogne, you have to go back 6 days, and you have to understand something about the man on the other side of the perimeter, because without that, nuts is just a colourful story. With it, it is a verdict. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. In the dense forests east of the Belgian and Luxembourg border, 3 German armies opened the largest ground offensive on the Western Front since the fall of France 4 years earlier. More than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by roughly 1,000 armoured vehicles, came out of the tree line before sunrise in a thick morning fog that grounded Allied aircraft and concealed the German columns until they were already among the forward American positions. The attack caught the Allied High Command completely off guard. American intelligence had concluded the Germans were too depleted to mount a serious offensive. The assessment held that their industrial capacity had been too damaged by Allied bombing, that fuel was too scarce for large armoured operations, and that rational military calculation would prevent Hitler from gambling his last reserves on a winter push through difficult terrain. All 3 conclusions were wrong. Hitler had spent months secretly concentrating his last strategic reserve, stripping other sectors, pulling panzer divisions off the Eastern Front, and aiming everything he had left at the Belgian port of Antwerp. If the Germans could reach Antwerp, they would cut Allied supply lines and split the British and American forces, potentially forcing a negotiated settlement that would buy time to deal with the Soviet advance in the east. The Ardennes was chosen precisely because Allied planners believed it was too difficult to attack through in winter. The forest canopy, the narrow roads, the high plateau terrain, all of these were supposed to make large armoured operations impractical. It had not stopped the Germans in 1914. It had not stopped them in 1940. It did not stop them now. The American units in the path of the assault were thin on the ground. The Ardennes sector had been treated as a quiet zone, a rest area for exhausted divisions, and an orientation posting for new ones. The men holding the line on December 16th had no reason to expect what hit them. Entire regiments were overrun in the first hours. Command posts were abandoned. The 106th Infantry Division, new to combat, was shattered within 48 hours. The 28th Infantry Division, already battered from weeks of fighting in the Hurtgen forest, found itself fighting on 3 separate axes simultaneously, losing men and ground faster than any reserve could offset. Those delaying actions, costly as they were, bought the time that mattered. By December 18th, the situation had deteriorated so rapidly that General Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun. The German penetration was already 50 miles deep in places. The road junction at Bastogne, where 7 roads converged in the middle of the Ardennes plateau, had become the critical point. The Germans themselves called it a road octopus. Every armoured column in the southern half of the offensive had to flow through or around it. Whoever held Bastogne constrained everything the Germans were trying to do. To understand why Bastogne mattered so much so quickly, you have to understand what the German plan actually required. The objective was Antwerp, roughly 90 miles to the northwest. To reach it in the time window Hitler had allocated before Allied reinforcements could seal the penetration, German armoured columns needed fast roads. The Ardennes Plateau in December is not fast road country. It is a maze of narrow lanes between high embankments, frozen streams, dense forest, and small farming villages. The handful of decent roads through that terrain all ran through Bastogne. German armoured units that bypassed the town could still advance, but more slowly, burning irreplaceable fuel along routes their own maps flagged as secondary options for good reason. Every additional day Bastogne remained in American hands compressed the German timetable a little further. A timetable already tight on December 16th was becoming unworkable by December 20th. At that conference on December 19th, Eisenhower asked his commanders how quickly they could act. Lieutenant General George Patton, whose Third Army was at that moment engaged with German forces to the south and east in a completely different direction, made an announcement that left the room quiet. He said he could attack toward Bastogne with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals were skeptical, and not without reason. No army as large as Patton's had ever been pivoted 90 degrees and reoriented while actively engaged with the enemy in living memory. Moving more than 133,000 vehicles onto new routes, with new supply lines, in winter, on ice-covered roads, while still fighting to the south, was a logistical problem that looked unsolvable in that time frame. General Omar Bradley suggested Patton give himself some leeway. Patton had not been improvising. He had quietly ordered his staff to begin drafting contingency plans for exactly this scenario weeks before the German attack. He arrived at Verdun with not 1 plan but 3, each corresponding to a different axis of advance, codenamed cent, nickel, and dime. Nickel, the axis running from Arlon north to Bastogne, was the one selected. He left Verdun and made a single phone call to his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. The Third Army began to turn. But before Patton's columns could reach Bastogne, someone had to hold the town long enough to make the relief meaningful. That task fell to the one large American reserve formation available at short notice, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, resting at Camp Mormelon in France after 72 days of continuous fighting in Holland during Operation Market Garden. The 101st was not ready. Its men were short on winter clothing. Ammunition stocks were incomplete. The division had been pulled from the line expecting weeks of rest. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the division commander, was in Washington attending a staff conference. The assistant division commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England. Command fell to the next senior officer available, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander. McAuliffe had never commanded a division in combat before. He was an artilleryman, a technical officer who had spent his career calculating trajectories and coordinating fire support. Born in Washington on July 2, 1898, to a family of Irish heritage, he had attended West Virginia University briefly before entering West Point in 1917. He graduated in November 1918 as part of an accelerated wartime program, then voluntarily returned and completed the full curriculum with the class of 1919. He advanced slowly through the peacetime army and was not promoted to lieutenant colonel until just before Pearl Harbor, at which point he was already in his early 40s. What is worth noting about that career arc is how unremarkable it was by the standards of the men who would eventually command divisions. McAuliffe was not a protégé of any senior general. He had not served on a theatre staff where he might have come to the attention of Eisenhower or Bradley before the war. He was an artillery specialist who had done his job well for 2 decades. His elevation to acting division commander in December 1944 was an accident of absence. He was there because Taylor was in Washington and Higgins was in England, and someone had to be in charge. On D-Day in June 1944, he jumped into Normandy as the 101st's artillery commander, despite having never received formal parachute training. It was the first jump of his life. He landed without injury. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, he arrived in Holland by glider as part of the division's artillery command structure, coordinating the fires that supported 72 days of continuous fighting in the Netherlands. By December, he was commanding a division by default, filling a gap in a table of organization that no one had planned for. His personal aide, Captain Vincent Vicari, would later say that McAuliffe was the only general he had ever served under who did not use profane language. The word nuts, Vicari recalled, was simply part of how the man talked. It was what he said when he dismissed something. Not a performance, not a chosen expression, just the natural language of a man who had spent his life being direct and who had no instinct for theatre. That is the thing about McAuliffe that matters before you can understand the reply. He was not the kind of man who would have chosen a dramatic word for effect. He was the kind of man who said exactly what he meant and then went back to work. On December 17th, McAuliffe began loading his division onto trucks. The convoy moved through the night in drizzle and sleet, using headlights despite the risk of air attack because speed mattered more than concealment. The column stretched from Reims to as far north as Bouillon in Belgium at one point, roughly 75 miles of vehicles grinding north in the dark. The destination was 107 miles away. What they found when they arrived at the edge of Bastogne was a situation with no clean edges. German armoured columns from the 47th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, were pressing in from multiple directions. American combat teams from the 10th Armoured Division's Combat Command Baker, which had arrived a day earlier, were fighting desperate delaying actions on 3 approach routes at once, trading tanks and men for hours. The first elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment reached the assembly area west of Bastogne just after midnight on December 19th. By 9 that morning, the full division had arrived. McAuliffe sent regiments forward to contact as they came in, committing them before the complete picture was clear, because waiting for the complete picture meant losing ground that could not be recovered. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion came in from 60 miles to the north and joined the perimeter that same night. By December 20th, the last road out of Bastogne had been cut. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. Now consider what that meant physically for the men in the foxholes. The total American garrison inside the perimeter, including the 101st Airborne, Combat Command Baker of the 10th Armoured Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various attached engineer and artillery units, numbered somewhere between 18 and 23,000 troops. German forces pressing against them from multiple directions numbered roughly 45,000 to 54,000 soldiers across 3 divisions. The ratio was approximately 2 to 3 Germans for every 1 American, and the Germans had the heavier armour. The 326th Airborne Medical Company, the division's main surgical unit, was overrun on the night of December 19th at its position outside the perimeter. It lost 11 officers, 119 enlisted men, and nearly its entire stock of surgical equipment as prisoners of war. From that night forward, the wounded inside Bastogne were treated in improvised aid stations with whatever could be found. Temperatures at night in that part of the Ardennes during that December regularly fell to between -10 and -20 degrees Celsius. Men in the foxholes north and east of Bastogne, including Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, dug into the wood called Bois Jacques near the village of Foy, had not been issued adequate cold-weather gear because the division had been rushed out of Camp Mourmelon with incomplete equipment. Without proper boots, frostbite developed within hours. Without adequate gloves, men lost feeling in their hands before the end of a night watch. The shelling came at irregular intervals, constant enough to prevent real sleep and unpredictable enough that there was no way to plan around it. Tree bursts from German artillery rounds exploding in the frozen canopy sent wooden fragments down as effectively as metal shrapnel. What made the physical conditions almost secondary was the tactical situation the paratroopers were managing inside those conditions. The perimeter around Bastogne was not a continuous fortified line, It was a series of strong points and roadblocks connected by patrol routes, with gaps between units that the Germans probed constantly, looking for a soft point they could exploit before defenders could shift reserves. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held the northwest shoulder against repeated attacks by the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The 506th held the northern sector, with its battalions fighting for the approaches to Foy after the forward position at Neuville had been evacuated on December 20th. The 501st held the eastern approaches. The 327th Glider Infantry stretched along the southern perimeter from Marvy in the southeast to Champs in the west. Between them, they were holding a circumference of roughly 16 miles with forces that were outnumbered, unsupported by air, and running short of the most basic materials of combat. McAuliffe managed this by doing what good artillery officers do. He mapped the defensive positions, identified the points most likely to be hit, and pre-positioned what mobile reserves he had to respond quickly when the Germans found a gap. He maintained contact with his regimental commanders and let them run their own sectors without interference from above. He made the decisions that needed making at the division level and left the smaller ones to the people who could see the ground. It was not complicated as a philosophy, but it required the kind of trust in subordinates that not every commander is willing to extend when his own perimeter is being attacked from multiple directions at once. By December 22nd, artillery ammunition inside the perimeter had been restricted to carefully selected targets. D-ration chocolate bars were being divided among groups of men. The division's entire surgical capability was gone. This was the situation German General von Luttwitz was looking at from outside the wire when he decided to try something other than direct assault. The contrast between the two men is worth examining. Heinrich Diepold Georg Freiherr von Luttwitz was born in December 1896 into a Prussian aristocratic family whose military tradition stretched back 6 centuries to the 14th century by his own family's reckoning. He competed in equestrian events at the Berlin Olympics of 1936, where his team failed to win a medal, an outcome the Nazi regime considered an embarrassment that stalled his career advancement for several years. He eventually rose to command the 2nd Panzer Division and later the 47th Panzer Corps, earning the Knight's Cross and Oak Leaves for his performance in France and on the Eastern Front. He wore a monocle. He commanded with the formal certainty of a man who had been raised in a tradition that treated military questions as problems with correct answers. By December 22nd, Bastogne was costing von Luttwitz time he could not spare. His supply routes needed those 7 road intersections at the town centre. Every day the town held, his panzer columns stacked up on icy roads instead of pushing toward the Meuse River. He had tried coordinated assaults from multiple directions. The American perimeter had bent in places but had not broken. He ordered his staff to draft a formal surrender ultimatum. He did this without informing his superior, General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army. Von Manteuffel had not approved the idea and was not consulted. The ultimatum was von Luttwitz acting unilaterally, which was consistent with German doctrinal tradition, but reflected a significant misread of the men he was dealing with. The deeper miscalculation embedded in the ultimatum was its assumption about what encirclement meant to these particular soldiers. German doctrine and German experience in multiple theatres had established a reliable pattern. Encircled units, cut from resupply and facing overwhelming force, reached a psychological breaking point within days. That pattern had held often enough that it had become a doctrinal expectation. What von Luttwitz did not fully understand was that the 101st Airborne Division had been specifically trained and specifically selected for exactly the kind of isolated, surrounded, hold-at-all-costs defensive action he expected to break them with. Its regimental commanders had led men in cut-off positions before. Its paratroopers had been told since the beginning of their training that being surrounded was not an emergency. For airborne infantry, it was the operating environment. There was also a piece of military logic that the ultimatum had inadvertently revealed. A commander who genuinely holds an overwhelming advantage does not ask the enemy to surrender, he destroys them. The formal offer of honourable surrender, with its language of annihilation and its 2-hour deadline, was a signal. It told McAuliffe that von Luttwitz was under time pressure and that taking Bastogne by direct assault was not going as planned. The ultimatum was not a show of strength. It was a negotiating gesture from a man who needed the problem solved quickly by means other than fighting. McAuliffe, an artilleryman who had spent his career reading situations, understood that immediately. He dropped the paper on the floor not because he was being theatrical. He dropped it because it had told him what he needed to know. On the morning of December 22nd, 4 Germans approached the American lines from the direction of the hamlet of Remoy-Fosse, southeast of Bastogne, on the Arlon Road. They were Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps Staff, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of the Panzer Lehr Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. They were carrying 2 large white flags. Private First Class Leo Palmer first spotted them. Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson first approached and confirmed they were parlementaires. Private First Class Ernest Premetz, who spoke German, joined as the officers were blindfolded. The 2 officers were walked to a platoon command post, and then to the headquarters of Company Fox, 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Major Alvin Jones, the regimental operations officer, drove to Company Fox, collected the message, and brought it to division headquarters at the Heinz Kaserne. The message was typewritten on 2 sheets, one in English, one in German. The diacritical marks on the German copy had been entered by hand because the typewriter was an English machine. The text ran to 165 words. It declared that the American forces in and near Bastogne had been encircled by strong German armoured units. It named several towns to the west as being in German hands. It offered one possibility to avoid total annihilation, the honourable surrender of the encircled town within 2 hours. It warned that 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions stood ready to open fire immediately when the deadline expired. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore brought the message to McAuliffe. McAuliffe's first response, reading it, was confusion. He assumed for a moment that the Germans were offering to surrender to him. When Moore clarified that it was the Americans being asked to surrender, McAuliffe read the document again, set it down, and said the words that multiple witnesses would confirm, "Us surrender," or nuts. He dropped the paper on the floor and walked out of the command post to the western perimeter, where a unit had destroyed a German roadblock that morning and deserved to be congratulated. When he returned, his staff reminded him that the German officers were still waiting at Company Fox's position for a formal reply. McAuliffe sat with his officers and admitted he was not sure what to write. He asked for suggestions. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, who had been the one to clarify that the ultimatum was demanding American surrender, offered a quiet observation. He told McAuliffe that his first reaction to the message had been pretty good. The room of tired men in a besieged barracks actually laughed. McAuliffe wrote the reply. It was 4 words. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. It was typed on a clean sheet. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, volunteered to deliver it personally to the German delegation. Harper found the 2 German officers still waiting under guard near Company Fox. He had their blindfolds removed and handed Major Wagner the envelope. Wagner opened it and read it. His expression, as Harper recalled it for the rest of his life, was complete confusion. He asked whether the reply was negative. Harper confirmed it was very much negative. He told Wagner that if the word nuts did not convey the meaning clearly, in plain American English it was the equivalent of telling them to go to hell. He added that if German forces continued to attack, every German who tried to enter Bastogne would be killed. Private First Class Premetz, standing nearby, translated Harper's explanation into German. The 2 German officers saluted with rigid formality and turned back toward their own lines. The promised artillery annihilation never came. Von Luttwitz's heavy guns had already been moved west of Bastogne and were out of range of the town centre. The Luftwaffe came instead, bombing the town on the night of December 22nd and on several nights following. Ground assaults continued around the perimeter, with German infantry and armour pressing at multiple points simultaneously. The fighting was particularly brutal in the tree lines north of town, where the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment held positions under constant artillery fire in Bois-Jacques, while German infantry tried to push through from the village of Foy. The Americans held. What German commanders found consistently perplexing, and what they returned to in post-war discussions, was the way the 101st responded to pressure. German tactical doctrine expected surrounded units to show increasing passivity over time as casualties accumulated and supplies ran down. Instead, the 101st's battalions continued to mount aggressive local counterattacks. They continued to call accurate artillery on German assembly positions. When German infantry found a gap in the perimeter line and began exploiting it, American reserves appeared from a direction the Germans had not anticipated and sealed the breach before a serious penetration could develop. The pattern repeated across the perimeter throughout the siege. German forces would find a soft spot, begin pressing it, and encounter a response that did not match the behavior of a unit approaching collapse. The explanation, in retrospect, is straightforward. McAuliffe had given his regimental commanders a clear mission and trusted them to fight their own sectors. The regimental commanders had given their battalion commanders the same room. When the situation changed, decisions were made by the men who could see the ground, not passed up a chain of command for approval. The ammunition was rationed, but the decision authority was not. That combination, scarce resources and genuine trust in the men using them, is what von Luttwitz had been looking at through the wire when he decided a formal ultimatum might achieve what direct assault had not. Inside Bastogne, Belgian nurse Augusta Chewy had been visiting her father when the siege closed around the town. She chose to stay and work alongside American medics in a forward aid station run by Captain Jack Pryor, tending to the worst casualties under conditions that would have justified any civilian leaving. She had no military status, no protection other than a Red Cross armband, and no adequate supplies. She remained through the entire siege. The American ambassador to Belgium formally recognized her decades later with the Civilian Award for Humanitarian Service. The men she treated would have known her name. The days between the delivery of the reply and the arrival of Patton's relief force were the hardest of the siege. On December 23rd, the cloud cover that had grounded Allied aircraft for a week began to break. 20 Pathfinders jumped into the perimeter from transport aircraft to set up radar beacons for the supply drop. On December 24th, the first major resupply mission reached Bastogne from the air. That same night, the Luftwaffe struck the town with its heaviest bombing of the siege. A direct hit on a building being used as a medical aid station killed Belgian nurse Renée Lemaire, who had been working alongside Chewy and Captain Pryor. The men who had been rationing ammunition and dividing chocolate bars among groups were by then handling crates of rifle rounds and mortar shells brought in by the supply drop. The sight of supply parachutes opening over Bastogne on Christmas Eve told every man on the perimeter that they had not been forgotten. That same night, McAuliffe wrote a letter to every man in the division. He told them the Eagle Division had stopped cold everything thrown at it from the north, east, south, and west. He included the text of the German ultimatum and his reply, word for word, so that every soldier in every foxhole would know exactly what had been said. He signed it, "The American Commander," the same words that appeared at the bottom of the reply he had sent to von Luttwitz 2 days earlier. On Christmas Day itself, German infantry from the 77th Panzer Grenadier Regiment launched a sizable assault on the positions of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment at the village of Champs on the northwest perimeter, beginning around 3 in the morning. The attack overran forward positions and pushed into the village before being contained. The crisis was checked by companies of the 502nd, supported by tank destroyers of the 705th Battalion firing at close range. Christmas Day ended with the perimeter intact. On Christmas Day, McAuliffe ate canned rations with his staff at the Heinz Kaserne. Patton's Third Army was still fighting its way north. The operational turn from the plan called Nickel was, in practical terms, one of the most complex staff actions in the history of American ground warfare. Pivoting 90 degrees northward while still in contact with German forces to the south and east meant simultaneously disengaging from active combat, reorienting supply lines across 3 divisions, and pushing more than 133,000 vehicles through road networks that were not built for that volume, in winter, with ice on every road. The Third Army's lead attack began on December 22nd. The same morning von Luttwitz's delegation walked up the Arlon Road with their white flags. Patton had been moving before the ultimatum was sent and before the reply was written. His advance was already underway. What is worth understanding about Patton's movement is that the 48-hour promise he made at Verdun was not recklessness, it was preparation. He had ordered his staff to begin drafting contingency plans for a northward pivot weeks before the German attack, after his own intelligence analysis suggested a major German operation in the Ardennes was possible. He arrived at Verdun with 3 complete operational plans, not one. The plan chosen, Nickel, called for a drive up from Arlon. His staff had already worked out the route assignments, the bridge crossings, the supply schedules. When Patton called his Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, from Verdun with the activation code, his formations were already preparing to move. The 90-degree turn of an army in winter combat conditions, which looked from the outside like inspired improvisation, was actually the execution of work that had been done before anyone in the room at Verdun knew the meeting would take place. The fighting on the approach to Bastogne was not the clean relief operation that post-war accounts sometimes make it sound. German forces defending the corridor south of Bastogne were capable and determined. The 4th Armoured Division's drive north cost it substantial casualties in engagements at Bougainville, Chaumont, and Remy-Champagne before the final push. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, drove his formation hard through the last stages of the approach. At 4:50 in the afternoon of December 26th, a Sherman tank named Cobra King from Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion broke through the German encirclement at the village of Assenois, southeast of Bastogne, and made contact with soldiers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion inside the perimeter. The siege had lasted 10 days. The road opened. Wounded men who had been waiting in improvised aid stations for more than a week began moving south on trucks. Supply convoys came in behind them. News of McAuliffe's reply had spread through the American perimeter by word of mouth from the moment Colonel Harper returned from delivering it. It reached American newspapers through an Associated Press dispatch filed December 22nd, which ran when the wire cleared on December 26th. The story spread nationally within days. By December 30th, the General and the word had become inseparable in print. Front pages across the country ran it without needing to explain why it mattered. The Richmond Times-Dispatch called it one of the classics of the war. The Cincinnati Enquirer said McAuliffe had stepped into immortality. An International News Service dispatch named him the briefest and best-known note writer in those parts. Eisenhower brought McAuliffe to Paris on January 2nd, 1945, for a press conference at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. McAuliffe answered questions in the same unhurried way he apparently conducted all his business. He told the assembled reporters that his men had never needed rescuing. They had held what they were asked to hold. On December 30th, 1944, Patton reached Bastogne and awarded McAuliffe the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony at the command post. Patton told him it was the greatest example of American fighting spirit he had ever seen. McAuliffe did not make a speech. The Presidential Unit Citation awarded to the 101st Airborne Division for the defense of Bastogne was the first ever awarded to a full American division. 341 men of the division were killed between December 19, 1944, and January 6, 1945. 1,691 were wounded. 516 were listed as missing. Those numbers cover the siege period only. Broader fighting around Bastogne through late January cost the division 482 killed, 2,449 wounded, and 527 missing or captured. The Battle of the Bulge was officially declared over on January 25, 1945. The German offensive, which had begun with such momentum on December 16th, collapsed across the Ardennes in the weeks following the relief of Bastogne. The forward elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, which had come closest to the Meuse River, were caught and largely destroyed by the American 2nd Armoured Division and British 29th Armoured Brigade at Celles on Christmas Day. The German army was retreating to the Rhine. The last strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht in the west had been consumed. The war in Europe ended less than 4 months later. Now here is what gets lost when this story is reduced to a clever reply and a famous photograph. The reply was not bravado. It was not chosen for effect. It was the involuntary response of a man who had already decided what the situation required and was being asked, by people with formal letterhead and a 2-hour deadline, to stop doing it. The idea of surrendering Bastogne had not been a live option inside McAuliffe's thinking from the moment he arrived. He had positioned his battalions, trusted his regimental commanders, and understood that the road network at the centre of that town was the key to whether the German offensive maintained its momentum or died in the Ardennes. Giving it up was not a question he had left open. When the ultimatum arrived, it told him something he had not known with full certainty before. A commander who truly holds an overwhelming advantage does not offer the enemy terms, he destroys them. The offer of honourable surrender was von Lüttwitz signalling that destroying the garrison quickly was not as straightforward as the ultimatum's language implied. McAuliffe dropped the paper on the floor because it had confirmed what he already suspected, and he had work to do. There is a deeper point here that the newspaper coverage at the time and the popular history since have tended to miss. The story was reported as a tale of defiant humour, an American general giving the Germans the brush-off in colourful slang. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The reply was funny because it was true. McAuliffe was not performing confidence for an audience. He was alone in a sleeping room with his chief of staff when he said it the first time, and he was sitting in a room full of his own exhausted staff when he wrote it the second time. There was no gallery. The word worked as a reply precisely because there was no calculation behind it. It was the unguarded expression of a man who had already assessed his situation and found no reason to change what he was doing. That is the thing about McAuliffe that the length of the ultimatum and the brevity of the reply accidentally measures. Von Lüttwitz needed 165 words to explain why McAuliffe should stop. McAuliffe needed one to explain why he would not. The gap between those two numbers is not a measurement of cleverness. It is a measurement of the distance between a man who was uncertain and a man who was not. Von Lüttwitz outlived the war. He participated in post-war operational history studies conducted by the American Army. He died in October 1969. Harry Kinnard, the operations officer who told McAuliffe his first reaction was hard to beat, went on to become one of the architects of American airmobile doctrine in the 1960s. He commanded the 11th Air Assault Division during its experimental development at Fort Benning, testing the concept of helicopter-transported infantry that would reshape how the Army fought. He then took that doctrine to war as commander of the 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam from 1965 to 1966, leading the first large-scale airmobile operations in combat history at the Ia Drang Valley. He retired as a lieutenant general in 1969. In interviews given across the decades between Bastogne and his death in 2009, he always described the moment in the command post the same way: exhausted men in a cold building who needed to find words for a formal reply, and realized the general had already said the only words that fit. McAuliffe went on to command the 103rd Infantry Division from January 1945 through the German surrender and into the occupation period. He rose to Commander of United States Army Europe, was promoted to 4-star General on March 1, 1955, and retired May 31, 1956. He served on the Army's advisory panels on chemical and biological defense and was one of the voices inside the post-war military advocating for racial integration, a position he had held since a pre-war study assignment at the Army War College. He died on August 11, 1975 at Walter Reed Army Medical Center and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The central square of Bastogne was renamed Place General McAuliffe. A Sherman tank with a German 88mm shell hole in its hull stands in one corner. The headquarters building of the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, opened in 2009, is named McAuliffe Hall. The men who made that reply worth sending are not all named in this account. The paratroopers in the foxholes at Bulge, who held their positions through the Christmas Eve bombing, the glider infantry along the southern perimeter who fought off armoured attacks with weapons that were not designed to stop tanks, the tank destroyer crews of the 705th Battalion who had driven 60 miles in the dark to reach a perimeter already under pressure, and who then spent 10 days making up in accuracy what they lacked in numbers. The artillery crews of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, who managed their ammunition as carefully as a man manages his last dollars, and who still placed their rounds on German assembly areas with enough precision to break up attack after attack before it could close on the American line. The medics who worked in basements without adequate light or equipment, and who kept working. They are why the word meant what it meant. There is something specific worth saying about the 463rd. McAuliffe, an artilleryman by training and instinct, understood better than most division commanders how to use a depleted ammunition supply to maximum effect. Rather than distributing fire evenly across a long perimeter, he concentrated it at the points where German formations were actually assembling for attack. His guns fired less but hit harder. German assault formations that should have closed on the American line were broken up before they could do so, repeatedly, across the length of the siege. The men in the foxholes were outnumbered and outgunned in terms of individual weapons. The artillery they could call on, used by a man who had spent 2 decades learning its mechanics, compensated for a great deal of what they lacked in everything else. History tends to distill a 10-day siege into a single exchange of notes, because the exchange is clean and quotable and the siege is not. But the notes were written on top of everything those men did in the days on either side of them. The reply worked because the defense worked. And the defense worked because more than 20,000 American soldiers, running short on everything that armies run on, held a 16-mile perimeter in the middle of a Belgian winter against an enemy with every material advantage, and refused, methodically and without drama, to stop. Von Lüttwitz had sent 165 words. McAuliffe sent 1. If your father or grandfather served in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944, in any unit, in any role, I would genuinely like to read their story in the comments. What unit, what town, what they remembered, if they ever talked about it. The men who held those foxholes and stuffed newspaper in their boots deserve to be named by the people who carry them. If this investigation gave you something, the like button helps this kind of history find the people who want it told accurately. Subscribe for the next chapter. There are many of them. McAuliffe went back to sleep after Moore left with the reply. He had a perimeter to run in the morning, and he was going to need the rest. That was the man. That was the word. That was what it cost. Nuts.